Good afternoon, ladies and some gentlemen that are in the public. It is truly a pleasure to be here in Korea, in South Korea, in the city of Seoul, to talk about two of the main artists of Mexico, Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. I am very clearly, because of your presence, that you are pretty much aware about Frida, and I hope that in this time you will also learn some aspects about Diego and their mutual relationship. So let's begin this rather smooth lecture in which we will pinpoint some aspects about their careers and the particular relation they had as artists. I will give this lecture in English, considering that there may be people in the public who understands perfectly English. My deep appreciation for Ms. Soni for her translation into Korean. And my congratulations to all the institutions in South Korea and in Mexico that made possible this exhibition and my trip here to the city. Very well. Well, let's begin talking about first Diego Rivera, the great Mexican muralist, who has a unique place of importance in international art history as one of the main artists of the Mexican mural movement of the post-revolution in the early 20th century. It is true that Rivera was not the only Mexican muralist who achieved international recognition, but it is true that he was the most discussed and most acknowledged of the three major Mexican muralists in the United States. And besides the fact that before returning to Mexico in 1921, he had an outstanding achievement career in Europe as a Cubist painter. So this is the man that Frida Kahlo met in 1925. Rivera was a mature artist in his early 40s, and he had already begun his career as a muralist in Mexico. On the other side, Frida Kahlo was a young woman artist. She was only 19 years old when she met Diego Rivera. She had never had formal studies in the art field. She was what we could call a dilettante artist. But she was young, she was clever, and she was ambitious, highly enchanting and seductive. And she became the partner of Rivera, and they became one of the most outstanding couples in art history. She had an exquisite beauty in a particular way of understanding life, quite unique in her way. But Rivera's career as an artist began much before. He had studied formally at the Academy of the Arts in Mexico City, obtaining prizes and recognition among his teachers at school. And in 1907 left for Europe for the first time to continue his scholarship. This is how he looked in 1907 when Frida Kahlo was born. He too was inquisitive and young and ambitious. As many Latin American artists, he left to Europe in search of fame. And indeed, he dedicated his time to study the post-impressionist movements in Paris. This is one of his early landscapes done in Europe in the city of Paris in 1908, Our Lady of Notre Dame, in a landscape of impressionist echoes from a very particular point of view. In Paris, he also became acquainted with the avant-garde movements. And between late 1912 and 1917, he became an outstanding Cubist painter. Not only a Cubist painter in style, but a theoretician as well. He shared a strong friendship with Pablo Picasso, Piet Mondrian, and Gino Severini. So he was familiar with all the achievements in the arts during the early 20th century. He was truly an artist of the Bohème Parisienne. Before returning to Mexico, he participated in the last avant-garde movement of Les Constructeurs in Paris. Abandoning Cubism as an experimental field, rereading the lessons of Paul Cézanne, and finding that painting needed to return to the academy, to drawing, and to tradition. These ideas were shared not only by Rivera, but also by artists like Matisse, Braque, and Picasso. It was what they called a return to the order, a new lecture of classicism. Some experts call this the neoclassical avant-garde trend. On the other side, Frida Kahlo was very young in Mexico City, studying in college. She was rather a conservative woman, trained in certain religious matters by her mother, who had experienced a tremendous accident when she was very young. She too was very inquisitive and wanted to achieve something in the art field. Her first works relate her directly to a European art history tradition. There was nothing modern or avant-garde in her art. It was a relecture of artists from the Renaissance like Sandro Botticelli, and a profound admiration for the painting of the Mannerist Italian artist Agnolo Bronzino. This is her self-portrait of 1926, dedicated to her then-boyfriend Alejandro Gomez Arias. But what is true about this painting is that since the beginning, Frida Kahlo would use art to communicate. Painting became a form to explore her narcissism and to project herself among the others, especially to those she beloved or wanted to enchant. Alejandro Gomez Arias had left for Europe, and she wanted to make sure he would never forget her. And who indeed could have forgotten Frida after receiving this painting? It's a haunting image of herself, with an inquisitive way of seeing to the spectator, and her hand driven to call attention to herself. But when Frida Kahlo met Diego Rivera in Mexico City around 1925, she started to develop a new personality. She embraced her Mexicanism, and in terms of ideology, she began to understand the goals of the cultural movement of the post-revolution. She understood that by the hand of Rivera, a new world would begin for her. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. They got married, and she understood perfectly that Rivera was the great artist. This is a painting Frida did in San Francisco in 1931. And as we can see, Frida considers herself small related to Rivera. She understands perfectly that he is the artist. She is the wife and the companion. She walks by his side and holds his hand. He fulfills the steps of a great artist, with his big feet standing on the floor. Hers are truly petite, and she barely stands on her figure. She is the proud Mexican wife of Diego Rivera. She was like a little doll on his side. And what we need to understand is that Frida was profoundly happy with this relation. But with Rivera on her side, Frida Kahlo started to experience many other things. She became aware of the international avant-garde trends. She began to understand modern art, a modern way of living explicitly sexual, different from her familiar and Mexican surroundings. She too began to grow as a person and as an artist. When Rivera was invited to New York to paint murals for the Museum of Modern Art, Frida Kahlo came with him. Rivera was a revolutionary artist of Mexico, with great recognition among American critics. He was a communist artist who had ideological concerns. He was profoundly interested in defending the poor classes of Mexico, and used his art as a vehicle to understand the injustice that our country lived. On the contrary, Frida Kahlo was an intimate artist. She painted in some way in the shadows of this major artist. She was truly committed to become an artist by herself, but never did she consider her art would become valuable in terms of how Rivera was understood. On the other hand, Rivera did a lot to help Frida Kahlo become an artist. He helped her to improve her techniques and gave her the security and confidence to continue on her career. On the contrary, that what has been written and said a lot about their relation, Diego Rivera was a true and profound admirer of the art of Frida Kahlo. And we need to understand that if Rivera had not acknowledged Frida, she would have probably never have developed as an artist. So again, Rivera was an artist by his own means who had achieved a career in Europe, who knew about the international art and avant-garde trends. And Frida Kahlo was a young artist beginning her career. She too began to explore with modern art, such as we can see in this early portrait of her sister Frida Kahlo, painted in 1928. There is nothing Mexican about this painting. And this is because Frida Kahlo was studying German art of the 1930s. In New York, she became aware of the new objectivity, and she was fascinated by the art of German painter Christian Schad. Schad is the model behind this painting. And this painting just proves how international Frida had started to begin her career. On the other side, Rivera was committed as a muralist artist. He dedicated his time and his efforts to paint walls in Mexico and the United States. He was profoundly committed to art. Through his work, his engravings, and his paintings, he would portray Mexico and his culture. He was a social committed artist. He wanted that modern art give respect to the unprivileged classes of Mexico, such as we can see in this lithograph done in 1932 in New York. The title of this lithograph is The Dream of the Poor. On the other side, Frida Kahlo became aware of who she was. She too started to come forward as an artist. And this is her second self-portrait in 1929. She understood, as we can see on the clock on the back, that now is the time for her to grow. The curtains behind her open and she steps forward, trembling, vulnerable, somehow erratic, but with a glaze in her eyes. And behind her a small airplane that symbolizes her dreams. In her early work of Frida Kahlo, we find here and there certain references to the painting of Diego Rivera, such as this double portrait of woman in 1928. But from the young girl with no experience, by this moment, she has grown truly as an artist. And meantime, Rivera began his international career in the United States, painting murals in California, Detroit, and New York. In New York, he portrayed the revolution of Mexico and the injustice and repression of the government that came after the revolution. His art truly portrayed Mexico and its culture in a arousing, exceptionally colorful way, with a modern and synthetic language. On the contrary, Frida was portraying small paintings. This is a very interesting photograph taken in 1932 in Detroit. We see the great muralist behind her, almost peeking into her art. While he is painting his great murals in the back, she is doing these little paintings in a certain intimacy, almost not aware of who he is. And this is the kind of relation they had, of mutual respect. We can see how admirer he was of her art. He never patronized her, and he wanted her to develop by her own means her career. This is one of the images I most like about this couple, because contrary to what has been written by feminist art historians and even the cinema, they were profoundly in love. So Frida Kahlo grew as an artist, and by 1938, she achieved her first art exhibition in the city of New York. It took place at the Gallery of Julian Levy. And indeed, by 1938, as we can see in this self-portrait, Frida Kahlo had grown. Now she stands by herself. Now the curtains open side by side. She stands in her complete figure, embellishing the image of the spectator, beautiful and self-secure. She has grown as an individual, as a person, as an artist. And this is how she met the surrealist poet André Breton in 1938 when he came to Mexico. Her painting also changed. It became surrealist in her own manner, complex and full of dreams, images that had never been painted in Mexican art tradition. But this was her inner world. Frida mainly painted for herself. She did the contrary to Diego Rivera. He painted about the others, she painted about herself. He painted about history. She painted about her biography. He painted with ideological awareness, social and political awareness. And Frida Kahlo explored who she was. I don't think she never truly understood what she was. She never. So the paintings are an intent to try to explore this. Her fears, her dreams, her anxiety, her illness, her love for Rivera. And while Diego Rivera tried to paint answers, Frida was mainly painting questions. The title of this painting of 1938 is What the Water Gave Me. But they were indeed a unique couple, accomplices in the way they understood life, accomplices in the adventure of the art. They shared many things: their love for Mexico, the love for the culture, the respect for the indigenous people, artists from the left. And while Rivera painted the epic history of Mexico in the walls, creating this fascinating public art as it had never been seen before in art history, truly modern, politically committed, monumental in size and achievement, frequent friend of important persons in 20th century civilization, such as communist leader Leon Trotsky, surrealist poet André Breton, and even scientists as Albert Einstein. Frida Kahlo was happy painting in her home, devoting her time and life to Rivera. She was indeed proud of her painting, but she never quite understood what would happen with her art. She never expected to become the public figure she is now. Painting for Frida Kahlo was a way of communicating her inner self. This is one of her most major and outstanding paintings. Her double self-portrait entitled Las Dos Fridas, the Two Fridas. This is a rather iconic piece in Mexican modern art. It is a haunting double self-portrait. Frida Kahlo reveals herself in complexity. She is not one but two. She is the Mexican artist on the right and the European artist on the left. She is the result of a duality. One is the Frida who still loves Diego Rivera on the right and who portrays his self-portrait in a little photo on her hand. And the other one suffers and her heart begins to bleed. For this man that she profoundly loves has requested divorce from her. She did this painting for an international art exhibit of surrealism that took place in Mexico City in 1940. But the painting is more about herself, of how she suffers, and the anxieties that she started to feel, considering that Rivera would leave her. They did divorce, but got married 1 year after in San Francisco. And they continued their career as artists and mutual respect. Frida frequently admired Rivera's art, and she would serve as a model in some of the murals Rivera did in the late 40s and early 50s. They were two artists with autonomy and personality, and she always kept in mind that her art was private. Her sufferingness was not something for others to see. Most of these little paintings were given away as presents to dear friends. She never quite believed that she would be understood as an artist, and never could have imagined that nowadays they talk more about her than Rivera, her husband. So there is a still personal relation of all her drawings and paintings around her. Like this drawing that she made in July of 1949. She writes in this drawing about how Diego Rivera is asking again for a divorce. And she asks the question, why? Why is he asking a divorce again? So as we can see, her painting and her drawings are about her own questions about life. Of course, in a quite surrealist language. But they kept themselves together. And when Frida became ill and more ill in the 1940s, Rivera stood by her side. From my perspective, as an expert who has studied both artists, the debate here among this couple is that for Frida, Rivera was the most important thing. But unfortunately for Diego, before Frida was his painting. And this is the struggle that lies beneath their relation. It was only until 1954, when Frida passed away, that Diego Rivera profoundly realized that she was the love of his life. And he passed away only 3 years after. Thank you very much for your attention. Well, now, if you would have any questions or comments that you'd like to make, I am very open to try to answer.
우리가 드라마나 책에 나왔을 때는 굉장히 프리다 칼로가 불행하지 않았나 이렇게 들었는데요. 지금 말씀하실 때는 행복했을 것이다 그러는 것 같더라고요. 그래서 우리가 전해 들은 거는 좀 잘못된 건가요?
I need a translation. Yes, it is. It is true. From the many letters I have studied of Frida, she once wrote, "The only thing I really want is to be happy side by side, Diego."
제가 강의를 좀 중간에 잠깐 다른 생각을 하느라고 제대로 못 들은 것 같기도 하지만 디에고나 프리다 사이에 자녀는 없었나요? 그리고 자녀가 있다면은 좀 부모를 닮아서 그런 좀 재능이 있었는지 그걸 좀 알고 싶습니다.
They didn't have children, even though they attempted 3 times to do so. Well, they probably attempt more than 3 times. But I mean, we are aware that she had 3 miscarriages. I think Frida Kahlo was some way incomplete with not having children. And on the other side, Rivera had already lived the experience with his first companion and wife in Europe, Angeline Beloff. He had a little son who died. And then later on, he had a lover named Marica. And there is still a daughter of Rivera. He never recognized her, but it is his self-portrait. And with his first wife in Mexico, Guadalupe Marin, he had 2 daughters. And one of those daughters still lives. It's Dr. Guadalupe Rivera Marin. And her sister Ruth, who passed away. We could say that Rivera was happy with the daughters he had with Lupe. And I don't think he missed having children with Frida. But on the contrary, I think she always felt incomplete. As to the question, if Frida had had children, she would have probably left her career as an artist. So, as an art historian, I am glad. Because on the other side, her legacy are these magnificent paintings in art history.
네, 강의 잘 들었고요. 너무 감사한데요. 제가 알기로는 프리다 칼로가 동생하고 디에고가 결혼을 했다는 걸 알고 있었거든요. 그리고 프리다 칼로가 아주 심한 교통사고로 인해서 몸이 아주 많이 안 좋았다는 걸 알고 있는데요. 그리고 나중에 죽기 전까지도 굉장히 좀 불행했던 걸로 아는데 지금 말씀하시기는 행복하다고 그러는데 이 디에고가 여성 편력이 대단했잖아요. 근데 그런 걸 어떻게 감수를 하고 한 번 결혼하고 또 이혼했다 또 다시 결혼하고 그랬던데 친동생하고도 결혼했다는 사실을 아는데 그건 어떻게 된 건지 궁금합니다.
Okay. Well, he never married Frida's sister, Cristina. He had an affair with her. And indeed, this was terrible for Frida. But on the other side, we would have to acknowledge that they had a very open sexual life. Frida had a lover for 10 years. His name was Nicolas Murray, an American photographer. And Rivera was aware of this. They were not a conventional couple. They were very sexually open and explicit. It is true that Frida was bisexual, but she did not need to define herself sexually. She didn't need to choose particularly anything. She just lived up to the experience. And it was understood between them that Rivera could have affairs. And he did so, many. Not as many as he would say, probably much less than she did. But those are like little facts of gossip. She's asking about the image of the exhibition. Yes, this painting that's in the collection of the government of Veracruz and that's in the show is a portrait of Angeline Beloff, the Russian painter. Up to now, we are not certain that he married her. They were not married in a church, let's say, but they did live as husband and wife. And they both acknowledged this. For Rivera, in his biography, Angeline Beloff was his first wife. But officially, he was married 4 times. The first with Guadalupe Marin, twice with Frida Kahlo, and at the end with Emma Hurtado. Yes, there's also a painting by Lupe Marin done by Rivera in the collection, yes. Well, I'm happy to have you here, and I'm glad to have come all the way here to Korea to talk about Diego and Frida, and thank you very much for your attention this afternoon. Thank you very much.